see that it goes live. We are live now. All right, wonderful folks from around the world. Welcome to a new edition of Happy Smarts Happy Hour, number 16. And I'm really, really happy to have Professor Ruut. Ruut, actually. I just got corrected yesterday when I was pronouncing it as Ruut. It's Ruut Veenhoven. I hope I'm getting it right, the pronunciation.
Yes, you do.
Right? Okay. Wonderful. Thank you so much for joining us. And as usual, we have the wonderful Elena from Peru, although she's Belarusian by ethnicity, and she moved to Peru because she loves the Latin culture. Right, Elena?
Yeah, I have Latin soul, Latin American soul.
Yeah, she has a Latin soul, and Latin people are happy. That's what we think, and maybe the professor will confirm this for us. Bob King says, I love these Saturday seminars. We love them too. Unfortunately, we're going to have to end with the next session with a repeat of Professor Vic Strecker from UMesh, and I'll talk a little bit about this in just a few minutes. But for now, let me turn to Professor Ruut. And by the way, you in the audience, please do tell us where you're from, okay? This is going to be particularly important today because we're going to be talking about country-level happiness, and that's the topic on which the professor is an expert, world expert on, perhaps the world expert on the topic. And so don't forget to mention where you're from because we're going to talk a little bit about country-level happiness. Okay, all right. So here we go. My first question to you, Professor, is about the interest in the topic of happiness. Until maybe the 1970s, okay, this is my understanding, and you can correct me if I'm wrong. Until the 1970s, there was a lot of interest, and there continues to be interest even to this day, on GDP, gross domestic product, which is an indicator of the economic progress and well-being of a nation. And we rate nations on GDP, which is the richest country. There's a lot of interest around it. But something changed around then. And then a lot of countries have started becoming really interested in this topic of happiness and started measuring happiness and so on. And can you tell us a little bit about the genesis of this interest in happiness? When did it start? Who were the main players? And how has it evolved over time?
Yeah. Well, let me start telling where I'm from. I'm from the Netherlands, and I'm an emeritus professor at Erasmus University. And after my retirement, now working at the Erasmus Happiness Economics Research Organization, because economists have also found interest in happiness. Well, how the interest in happiness developed, maybe I'm an illustrative case. I studied sociology in the 1960s. And in the 1960s, we had the report of the Club of Rome and the awareness of the limits to growth. And so in my country, it became a political issue. And people said, well, we have enough economic growth now. And the Netherlands had recovered from the Second World War. There was material affluence. And then people said, well, we have enough wealth, and now we need well-being. And this raised the question, what is well-being? And the socialist government in charge at that time said, well, well-being is public goods. That is social security, that is public libraries, all kinds of facilities. Well, and I thought there's nothing wrong with that. But what is the difference with wealth? And so, for instance, you had the government subsidized community house where you could drink a beer, subsidized beer. But you can also drink the beer in the commercial pub. And well, and the real radical said, well, you shouldn't drink in the pub because that's capitalist beer and better drink the public beer. And I said it's actually nonsense. In the end, you pay. Either you pay in the pub to the pub owner, or you pay a tax, and then the government decides what will be bought from that. So I didn't see that as a solution, and rather said, well, well-being is also feeling well, and being satisfied with your life. And then the question is, will you be more satisfied if the beer is sold in the community house or in a regular pub? And so that, as a student, started my interest in happiness as, well, the subjective enjoyment of life. And there was still another thing, because in the 90s...
Professor, I want to stop you for just 1 second here, because I think you make a very, very, very good point that is often missed in a lot of the happiness discussions, which is the difference between the subjective state of happiness and the means to happiness. And we often confuse the two. You know, when people are asked how happy you are and what makes you happy, people often say, well, you know, I'm a 9 out of 10, etc. And what makes me happy? Maybe drinking a beer makes me happy, socializing makes me happy. And the 9 out of 10 subjective rating is your happiness level, and beer and the hanging out with is the means to happiness. And you're saying that your big contribution to this in terms of understanding this was to propose to the government and to the policymakers that let's measure happiness directly, and let's figure out what means lead to more happiness, rather than assume that public beer is going to make people happy or private beer is going to make people happy. Correct?
Yeah, that is correct. And I also said, if you define happiness as public goods or means, then you get into circles. And because then you measure the existence of conditions in the country, say, well, that's happiness. Well, and even if most people are depressed, too bad. So now we have better light. But let me continue my personal story in the 1960s. At that time, it was the time of radicalism, and a lot of my co-students turned red. They became very leftish, and they believed that paradise was in the Soviet Union. And most of them had a poster of Che Guevara in their student room. And they thought that people would become very happy in Cuba when the revolution was successful. And here again, it was an ideology, the idea that socialism would make you happy. And in the discussions, I said, well, that is well possible, but let's see whether people in Eastern Europe at that time, in the communist time, whether they really enjoy life. Well, in the beginning, that was not too clear, but later it became clear that they did not, and that a lot of them tried to escape from the socialist paradise. So this was another reason to focus interest in happiness. And as a student, you have to write papers. I wrote a paper on happiness and gathered the few available studies on happiness. And that were not too many, so it was an easy paper. But it was so nice to do that I continued, and I still do in my World Database of Happiness.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a wonderful personal story. And in the meanwhile, I guess the young king of Bhutan in 1972, Jigme Singye Wangchuk, took over from his father and said that, well, you know, we are going to prioritize happiness. And that seems to have caught some countries' attention at least. And since then, there's been a burgeoning interest in the topic of happiness. More and more countries measuring it. Some countries even having the United Arab Emirates, a ministry of happiness and so on. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, there is an analogy because the king was also inspired by the Club of Rome report. And what happened after the Club of Rome report, that not only people started happiness in the sense of life satisfaction, but they also started to measure non-economic social indicators. And so at that time, the social indicator movement started. And actually, and then most countries started to make well-being reports. And that also happened in Bhutan. The only difference is that in most countries they called it well-being. In Bhutan they called it happiness. And that gave rise to the misunderstanding that in Bhutan they measured happiness in the sense of subjective enjoyment of life. No, that's not what they do. The pillars of gross national happiness are education, good food, sensible government, protection of nature, and in particular in Bhutan, the protection of culture. And well, there are also political reasons why the king did that. And in my view, one of the reasons was that Tibet had been occupied by the Chinese. So Bhutan was in danger. Bhutan had to open to the West, but the conservative clergy was not very enthusiastic for that. And so the idea of gross national happiness, in my interpretation of Bhutanese history, was also a means to show that, okay, we open to the West, but we will not Americanize. We won't go for the big money, and we will preserve our culture. And that's why also in the pillars of gross national happiness and preservation of culture is an important thing, and which, well, very much to the pleasure of the powerful clergy, and because, yeah, it was at that time still a rather medieval country, and with a very strong clergy, which you, and in that case, you better not modernize too soon. And so I think it's a very wise policy.
Wonderful. Yeah, I did not know about this particular aspect of trying to escape being captured by the Chinese, playing into this prioritization of happiness. But it makes sense. And by clergy, just to clarify, you're talking about the Buddhist monks.
Yes, and they are a powerful force in the country, and well, realize that they also have a military history, and the cloisters are fortresses. As they were in medieval time. That's a bit like the Christian, how do you call it? The fighting monks in the Christian history. So you better keep these friendly.
Yeah, absolutely. By the way, I am on my end detecting a little bit of internet streaming problems at your end, Professor. I don't know, Elena, you're too? A little
Me
bit?
too. Yeah.
Okay. I don't know if there's any way in which it can be improved by maybe closing some other devices or something like that. All right. So let me just turn to another question, and then I'll have Elena come in with her questions and perspectives. So my question to you is about the happiness of countries, on which you're a world expert, of course. And there are lots of people from lots of different places in the world, and maybe Gayatri will summarize this for us later on, how many countries are represented here and so on. And I'm sure that most of them are very curious about the happiness of countries. So let me ask you this. Which are the happiest countries in the world? And which tend to be the least happy countries in the world? If you can just give us a broad overview of that. And I know that you also have a world database, a happiness database, and it's you have a website, and maybe you want to share the screen with us for that. I don't know, but that's a big question. Which countries are the happiest? Which countries are the least happy? And maybe a little bit about why.
Well, the big surprise is that the most happy countries are also the most modern countries, while in modern countries there's a lot of people who bemoan modernity and say that life was better in the past. And that appears not to be the case. Let me share screen and show the world map of happiness.
Okay.
And share screen. And yes, share. Now nothing happens. Too bad.
Yes, we tried this yesterday and it worked. So
it worked. I try again, but now it doesn't work. So we don't share screen. I tell. Um,
The
We
other thing, I could share the screen with people if you can just tell me the URL. So World Happiness Database.
yeah, World Database of Happiness.
Okay. All right, and I'll go there, and you're going to have to lead me to the particular
Yeah.
aspect of. Let's see here, Chrome tab. Okay, is it showing up?
Yeah,
Yay.
it's showing up. Yes.
Okay,
And
now you have to lead me.
now, yes, then in the left column, you go to happiness in nations, regions.
Okay.
And now you go to finding reports in the
Okay, is
left
it on the
column.
left?
Yeah, finding lower, 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 lower,
Yeah.
lower. Yeah, finding reports. Click. And we have rank of nations in the second column, and there you click on map. So next to that, yes. And there you see the map of happiness, and the darker the green, the happier the people. And what you see that, well, dark green is Scandinavia, the Netherlands. Yes, you see in the data, if you are there, you see also the average on a scale from 9 to 10. You see in Canada, people are pretty happy. And yes, and actually the happiest country is Denmark. Yes, 8.3 on the scale 0 to 10. I think that's close to the maximum possible. It's not possible that you have an average of 10 in a country because life has inevitable sufferings and one country cannot serve all people equally well. Well, and you also see that in Australia and New Zealand, people are pretty happy. So typically, modern Western nations and the most free nations are the happiest.
Okay, so let's take a look at the look at America. America is 7.1, and India, we have a lot of people. India is bad. I mean, India is 4.8, probably 130 or something like that out of 200 countries in the world, right?
Yeah. Well, the worst is in Africa.
Yeah. Yeah, Central African Republic, South Sudan.
Yeah.
3.4. Tanzania. Botswana is 4. Wow. I mean, I would have thought Botswana would be a little bit happier. Madagascar. And this is what, Senegal? What is this?
There's no. That is South.
Mauritania, maybe.
No, Mauritania is there. No, that is the former Spanish Sahara. But there is no, at that time, no happiness surveys like in North Korea. That's also empty. But you can try to find Bhutan.
Yeah, this is North Korea. And Bhutan here, right here. India, it's not picking up Bhutan. It's supposed to be right here.
Yeah, it should be there. Nepal, but anyway, Bhutan is, so 5.6, which actually for a country in this state of development, not bad, and they're also improving. But typically, people thrive best in the most modern countries.
Okay, sorry, Professor, I have a quick question here because I think that this is related to some of the questions that are coming up and often is a cause of confusion. And we talked a little bit about this when we talked about means to happiness versus definition of happiness. There's lots of measures of happiness that assume that if these conditions exist, people must be happy. So if there is a lot of protection of nature, for example, people must be happy. If there's high GDP, people must be happy. Or if there is protection of culture, people must be happy. That is one way to kind of impute happiness of a country. Another way to do it more direct, which I think you favor, is to directly ask the people, how happy are you? Okay, I'm not going to make any assumptions that if these conditions exist, you will be happy. I'm just going to ask you how happy you are and take the average of that. And I imagine that this world database that we're talking about, that's how those numbers have been constructed, correct?
Yeah. The core question here is, taking all together, how satisfied or dissatisfied are you with your life as a whole these days? Please indicate in a number between 0 and 10.
Okay. So can you tell us a little bit about the philosophical difference between, let's say, how Bhutan measures happiness, which is to say that, well, our country is happy if we have enough GDP, if we have enough protection of environment, if we have enough cultural protection, if we have enough of a good social life, etc. So I'm going to ask people, how good is your social life? How good is the environmental protection, etc. And I'm going to average people's responses to that. And I'm going to assume that that must mean that they're happy, versus directly asking people how happy you are. What is the philosophical difference between the two? And why is one of them better in your opinion?
Well, there is an empirical difference. And so you can have everything you want, but still be unhappy. And it's also possible that you don't have all the things you want. Typically as a student who doesn't have a job, a diploma, and sometimes not even a girlfriend, but even these students can be happy. And well, the same holds for countries. And of course, you need a minimum of economic affluence. You need a minimum of safety. And yes, there is a correlation. And even among rich countries, when they get richer, then even they become a bit happier. But in the countries in Africa, if they get a bit richer, they get about an equal amount happier. So there is a connection between the conditions of life and the appreciation of life, but that connection is not 100%. And just as Elena said, in the Maslow pyramid, of course, if the basic needs are met, yes, that adds to happiness. And if these basic needs are met sufficiently, well, then the average in the country will about 6. But for, well, the higher needs, the self-actualization, then other things come into play, and one of which is freedom, and that is the ability to find a way of life that fits you.
Right. Okay, so I'm going to bring Elena in, but I just want to make a quick comment here. It is very interesting that you said that, you know, in some countries you may not have this, you may not have that. In fact, you may not even have a girlfriend. Okay, yeah. Now almost as if that is the most basic thing that you need to have. And
the students then drink a lot of beer as a compensation.
A lot of beer. So that is very, very interesting, because in India, at least when I was growing up, maybe things are different now, but having a girlfriend or boyfriend was not really something that happened quite a lot. Okay, Elena, to you now.
I have a technical question. How are these surveys and polls conducted in every country? So is it online? Is it how many people are actually participating that represent the country?
Yeah, well, typically in a small country you have 1,000, and in big countries like the US you have 3,000. And we're interviewing is cheap, just as in China you can have 10,000. And depends a bit. Most of these data are based on face-to-face interviews, but there are also interviews on the telephone, and that has an advantage. There is less social distortion if you do it on the telephone. And in the face-to-face context, increasingly it's done on computers, and that the respondent ticks an answer. For instance, in the response to the question, how satisfied are you with life? He ticks a 6 without the interviewer seeing that.
And how are these people contacted and selected?
Well, typically at least 1,000. And these several countries have more surveys in this period. This map is based on a 10 years period. Well, and in that period, there were 8 surveys in Denmark, and in the US, there are a lot of surveys, but in some of the Latin countries, for instance, in the case of Costa Rica, there was only 1 survey.
Yeah, so I thought Elena's question was, how are these people selected, not how many?
Yeah. How? What's the way they're found?
Oh, dear, it's random sampling. So typically, you first take a sample of postal districts, and within that sample in the postal district, you take a random sample of streets, and then you take a random sample of house numbers, and then you ring. And then you, when the door is opened, you say, "Well, taking all together, how satisfied or dissatisfied are you with your life as a whole today?"
And
Then
so,
you do that 5 times.
and
So-
who's collecting the data all over the world? So is it this is done locally in every country, and then who is getting this information together in all these databases? Who's responsible for that? Is there like an international happiness body?
No, well, there is an international happiness database, and that's what I run. And I take the data from other organizations. And one big supplier of information is Gallup. Gallup runs the Gallup World Poll, which is held in all countries in the last 8 years. There's also the World Value Survey, which runs surveys in about 80 countries since the 1980s. And there is the Latino Barometro, which is held, I think, every 4 years, and the European Barometer. So there's a lot of survey programs. And what I do, I gather the results on happiness and put them in the World Database of Happiness. And then select the responses to comparable questions. And because you can ask the question on happiness in a lot of different ways, but if you want to compare, it should be the same question. And the result is such a map.
Okay, wonderful. So I want to ask you a question that has been kind of on my mind for a bit. And I'm sure a lot of Indians will relate to it, and as well a lot of Pakistanis, I think. Because if we look at India, 4.8, Pakistan, 7.3. Okay, big difference. And I think that a lot of Indians would be surprised by it, because we think of Pakistan as relatively unstable politically and more prone to upheavals and things like that. And yet it is worlds ahead in terms of happiness levels. So a lot of Indians would look at it, I think, Professor, and say that, I'm not sure that I can trust this database. What would you say to that?
Well, let's then go here and look at mean level. If you click there.
Okay, mean
And
level
next to map, and then we can see how many. So if you click level
mean, this one?
Yeah,
okay.
Yeah, and then we can get a table,
and
then we go to here. You see how many, the number of surveys,
number of surveys.
And then we see whether it's only one survey. If you go down to Pakistan,
there's only one survey. Okay,
only one survey. Yeah, and that's like in the case of Costa Rica. That can be. It can be fraud. It can be a mistake. We can also look in more detail if in the left column, if you go by nation, region, you click that. In
the left column here?
Yeah, by nation, region. Click. And now we go again to Pakistan.
Okay.
Then we can also see the happiness in the. So you go down. You see, and you see if I have the a time series, and in this case of another question, that well, it's below 6. It's more like India. But this is not a question, and in the map, I used the questions which are best comparable over the world, and that gives another picture than the most often used question in Pakistan here, and you see that they remained about equally unhappy.
Okay. So let's look at India now here. It has actually kind of gone down over the years, especially in the recent past. It's gone down quite a bit, which is very interesting because economically India is supposed to be doing quite well, certainly compared to the 90s. But even recently. By the way, I mean, I don't mean in any way at all to suggest that Pakistan shouldn't be happier than India or anything like that. It's just my reading of what a lot of Indians might think about the relative happiness of these two countries intuitively. That's all I meant. And I do wish Pakistan all happiness, and all the countries actually, to be as happy as they can be. All right. One more question, Professor, and then maybe we can take to Elena again, a couple of questions, and then move to the general audience. Can you tell us a little bit about which countries have shown the most remarkable improvement in happiness over the time period that you measured it, which have shown the least improvement or, in fact, worsened over time, and why might that be?
Well, what surprised me most is the case of Denmark. Maybe you can go back to the list of nations.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and then the list of nations by
no, here just in the left, yeah. So, and now we go to Denmark.
Mm-hmm.
And Denmark is the happiest country in the world.
Mm-hmm.
And well, then the question is there more happiness possible? Mm-hmm. And the comforting thing is that the Danes, who were already quite happy in the 1970s, gradually they got happier. And actually, in the last 40 years, they gained half a point.
Mm.
And, well, the intriguing question is, will the rise continue? And where is the maximum level of happiness in the country? Mm. Well, this is an optimistic case. If you go to Greece, and so here you see, the Greeks were not too happy anyway, actually close to Pakistan. But you see what the recession in the early, about 10 years ago did. Mm. And it was not just an economic recession, it was also an institutional crisis, because the people realized that it was in the way the society was organized. Mm. Well, and then the European Union came in with a lot of money, and things are getting better, but still amazingly low for such a beautiful country with such a rich culture.
Yeah, actually, that region, I've visited Bulgaria a few times. I know that Lyubov is here, who's a good friend of mine from Sofia. One question I often get asked by Bulgarians is, why are we unhappy as a nation? And that region seems, Greece, Bulgaria, neighboring countries, Albania, Macedonia, maybe even all the way to Georgia, Moldova, those set of countries tend to be not so happy for some reason, even though it's very beautiful and pretty, and they're part of Europe. And some of these countries are part of the European Union even.
Yeah. And what we see after the fall of communism, we expected that all the earlier communist countries would become very happy. Actually, they did not. Actually, happiness dropped for a while, and then after 10 years restored. And in the case of East Germany, they are now at about the same level as West Germany. But the Westies pumped a lot of money in East Germany, and there was also a lot of migration. This process of fall and come back takes longer in countries like Bulgaria. And why is that? Why is there a drop? One of the reasons is that a lot of people lost their job because the socialist economy didn't work, and Western countries took over. And a lot of them had to move to Western Europe to do migrant work. Well, and not too pleasant for the families left behind. That's one thing. But there is also a problem of, say, psychology. These countries were already in the past pretty collectivistic, and that tendency to collectivism has been emphasized during communist rule. And then again, once at the moment, stepping into the free society, where you can make your own choices, while you have not learned how to make choices. If there's nothing to choose, then you cannot train yourself to make the best choice. And I think that's also a problem. And we see that especially at the unhappiness, the decline of happiness is mostly among elderly people, and while the younger people typically profit from the change in regime.
Wonderful. Yeah, great answer. And I think a big theme that emerges is just wait a little bit, and maybe in another 10 years, Bulgaria is going to be much happier and catch up like East Germany did. Okay, Elena, a couple of questions from you, and then we'll go to the audience. Gayatri, please be ready with your questions from the audience, okay?
So I have a few questions. Well, the first one was actually related to what you said. It's a mystery if they will ever be happier, the Danes. So I was thinking, do you think any country will ever be able to reach 10? Because I'm thinking, it's a human, it's our personality. I think we're never satisfied with what we have, and we would never say, yeah, I'm the happiest that I can ever be. I think we would always consider, in comparison with our full potential of being happy, and in comparison with how happy we feel right now, we would never say we're 100% happy. We will always think there could be more.
Yeah, well, there are still a lot of people who score 10. If you give them the question, also in Latin America. And it's not that these people say, well, now I have everything I want. No, even if there are things you want and you work for, that makes you feel happy. And I think inside we also owe to Abraham Maslow is that we have an innate need to grow, to use our potentials. And for using your potential, you better not have everything you want, because then there's nothing to do, and then you get bored. And I think one of the reasons why people are happy in Western society is that there are a lot of things that keep you going. It's not only the competitive economy, but it's also in sports, and you can also grow in arts. And there are in this varied culture a lot of challenging subcultures. And that makes that a lot of people function well and feel happy as a result.
Mm-hmm. And I was also thinking, okay, so it's very important how each and everybody feels, personally, how happy we are as people living on this planet Earth, regardless of which country we live in. But since we are conducting the surveys on the level of countries, and we're dividing, you're in this country, and so we're comparing like this, and we are taking into account the conditions that different countries have, that people living in different countries have. So I was thinking about the application of this for the future. So now we can see the picture, we see where we're tracking this information over the years, and so how can we really use it for the future? Maybe we could proceed now to, since we know this information per country, maybe we could move further and recommend countries to somehow govern that from the level of government, to establish some kind of happiness controlling or boosting or improving ministries or something, so that we could use this information to increase further happiness of the citizens of that particular country.
Yeah, of course, that's the question. That's why you do this research and to derive policy advice. And one of the things is economic development. And though much criticized, it's clear that in a rich country, people are happier than in a poor country, and economic growth, better not too fast, but constant growth is good. And in keeping the economy alive, then policymakers often have the choice between inflation and unemployment. For instance, now in the corona crisis, there is a danger that a lot of people lose their jobs Well, that will lower the average happiness in the country. And how can you avoid that? Well, pump a lot of money in the economy, well, which is being done now, but that involves inflation. Well, on the basis of the data, we see that people suffer less from inflation than from unemployment. So, in that perspective, and the policy road taken is a good policy. That's one thing. And that is very much in the forefront of policymaking. A thing that is not very high on the political agenda, but is still very important, that is the investment in mental health. And how happy you are, it depends very much on your mental health. And well, that's universal. But it's most apparent in rich countries, because if you're if the conditions are okay and you're still not happy, then that is often a matter of mental health. And then what we see is that the more countries invest in mental health care, the happier the citizens are. It's a bit like the more doctors per capita, the longer people live. And if you have the more psychiatrists and psychologists per capita, the happier people live. And that is a hard truth, but there is a little political support. And that is part of the political process, because there is not a strong pressure behind. In the case of physical health, there is a strong lobby from the pharmaceutical industry, from well-organized doctors, and for instance, in the case of cardiological illnesses, there is a strong patient organization, and these press for public money into healthcare. But in the case of mental health, there is not such a group. And the mentally ill people cannot organize themselves very good. And I'm afraid that psychiatrists and psychologists miss the training to bring their case on the political agenda. But still, the data show that small investment in mental health care yields much more happiness than the same investment in the already well-financed somatic health care.
Wonderful. All right, so I'm going to bring Gayatri up now. And Professor, you can tell me if you want me to shut out the World Database so that all of us can be seen on the screen, or do you think that...
Go back to the map.
Go back to the map. Okay, so can you just show me where how to get back to it?
Yes, you click on Happiness in Nation Regions.
Happiness
on the left column.
Left column? Oh, yeah.
The collections. And then you click on Finding a Report.
Finding report.
Lower.
And then map, yeah.
Yeah, and now we have here, and here we have the map of happiness in nations.
Okay, good. So Gayatri, I know there's lots of questions here, and some of you are asking about happiness of a particular country like Lithuania, etc. You can probably kind of Google that a little bit later, or I'll share this link with you guys. You can go and check it out yourself. Vaijayanti, I actually am very familiar with Rajan Sansthan. I'm a part of the governing board for that institute, and we can talk about that a little bit. There are some states in India that are very interested in happiness and measuring it and so on. So over to you, Gayatri. Any specific questions that stand out?
There's a question from Roshni.
You haven't made a note of it?
Yeah, I did.
Okay. Yeah, please put a note of it, Gayatri, in the future. That way, you have it. You don't have to come back.
Yeah. So she asked as to when she listened to this TED talk, she did talk about how more developed countries. The suicidal rates are more in developed countries than that of the other countries. So how do happier countries, they do have a larger rate of suicidal rate. So how do we measure that, or how do we correlate to it?
Yeah, well, that is a good question, and there has been a lot of research. Well, on the first view, you see that in the more unhappy countries, there is a bit more suicide, but the difference is not as great as you would expect. And one of the reasons is that there is in collectivist countries, where people are typically less happy, there is an underreport of suicide. And because it's a shameful thing, and so it's not in the statistic. That's one thing. The other thing is that people are happiest in the country where there is most freedom, and also most freedom to end your life. And so the condition that raises happiness also allows some people who are unhappy to end their life.
Okay. Wow. That's very interesting. So, what do you think of euthanasia, Professor? Do you think it's a good idea? Should people be allowed to end their own lives in a medical way? You know, I know that Switzerland allows it, Oregon and the United States allows it. What do you think of that?
Yeah, well, I'm very interested in the issue. It's also an issue in the Netherlands, and we have a fairly liberal euthanasia law. And I checked. Also, there's a few countries which have such laws, and yes, in these countries, people are happier. But it goes together with other freedoms. In these countries, you're also more free to be gay, for instance. And so the freedom to end your life through euthanasia is part of a wider freedom syndrome.
I wanted
Let me
to. Yes, sorry.
I'd like to expand a bit on freedom, taking the difference in happiness between Northern Europe, the Netherlands, and France. You see that in France, people are less happy than they are in the Netherlands and Denmark. But they are equally rich, and for the law, they are equally free. But in freedom, there's one thing is that you are free from legal restraints. But freedom also requires that you have the guts to choose and that you know what you want. And that is what we call psychological freedom. And you have social freedom, and for instance, euthanasia is allowed, but you have also psychological freedom that you dare to do it. And we were very puzzled why the French are less happy than the Dutch and the Danes. And we looked at all factors, and what we found, the only big difference was a difference in self-esteem. And so the Dutch and the Danes like themselves more than the French, which is strange because it's a proud the people. And then we delved deeper in it, and I think we found the clue in the education system. And we found data about what happens in the classroom. How, for instance, math is taught. And actually, you have two ways. One way in the class is that the teacher is the guide. So let's solve the surface of the circle. How do we do that? And the other is that the professor is in front and say, this is it, read the book, and you have a test. Well, countries differ in their educational culture. And actually, Denmark is at what we call the participative side. And the students, and the pupil, and the teacher participate in learning some things. Whereas in France, it's very directive. And actually the same as Japan, because the Japanese ever copied the French system. Well, what we believe is that if you expose young children in their adolescence, when they are in the secondary education, and when they are 5 to 6 years in a very hierarchical system, which in the case of France is also very selective. You pass not because you're good, no, you should be the best. And the same in Japan. And we think that undermines your self-esteem. And when your self-esteem is lower, then you have less psychological freedom. And for instance, if you make a big decision, you find a nice boyfriend, and you go to your mother and say, well, that's him. And mother says, no, that's not the right guy for you. If you have low self-esteem, you marry the guy, the ideal son-in-law of your mother, rather than your lover. And that will, in the long run, depress your happiness. And so I think there is also a clue in the educational system, which is also not very well recognized.
Very, very, very interesting. Freedom is very, very important, and it comes in two varieties: sociological freedom and psychological freedom. And if you might have sociological freedom, country level freedom, but if you don't have psychological freedom, you're not going to be happy. And that psychological freedom, a lot of it is formed in your formative years when you're growing up. Maybe also because of parental influence, but certainly educational system influence. Very fascinating.
Yeah, it's a very interesting topic for me as well, working in this field of education. And I totally agree with you, Professor Ruut, about teacher-centered or student-centered environment. And there's a big difference. But coming back to the topic of suicides, I was thinking, when people live in developed countries and people at young age have achieved so many things, they probably are well off and they have a very great job and they have everything they want. They have already bought their property, they have cars, whatever. So I feel like, and I actually talked to some people who feel like they are bored. They're very young, but they have nothing to strive for. And I think this is maybe the point when purpose in life comes into place. That's something that we discussed last time, because these people, they actually say, nothing makes me happy. I go on vacation to that place. I don't want to earn more money because that money doesn't make me happy anymore. And so I feel depressed. And then they maybe get on antidepressants. And though I think that this is like the other side of well-being, the financial well-being, when you have everything you want and then there's no more things to wish. And if you don't have a strong purpose, you're very likely to think about committing suicide or falling into depression.
Yeah, and I think so. There is, if you have everything, there's no challenge. And the other side of the medal is that, if you're unhappy and you're in bad conditions, then you say the problem is in the conditions. But if the conditions are okay and you feel depressed, you say, well, I'm doing something wrong. And that's why more people in the West go to psychotherapists. But it doesn't always help, and especially young people often don't go to a professional, and then they get in a dip. And yes, sometimes they commit suicide, which, in an overall view, could have been avoided if they had used professional help before.
All right, Gayatri, we have another 7 minutes or so left. Maybe we can get 2 or 3 questions in from the audience.
I have an interesting question from Luis. So he asks as to, when are we going to move beyond the country unit of measurement? So people are happy, not countries, right or wrong?
So
please repeat, because I can't really hear it very well.
Okay. So when are we going to move beyond country unit of measurement? People are happy, not countries, right? Wrong.
Yes, it's true. It's people who are happy. The country is not happy. You have an average level of happiness in the country. And in some countries, there's more difference here in the left column, you see inequality in happiness. And you can compute an average, but you can also compute the standard deviation. And please click on it on the map of inequality.
Map of inequality. Sorry, I didn't fully here. Here it is. This one.
Yeah.
Okay.
Now this is the trend in nation. No, well, that's another interesting. You go back. So we have rank of nation, and here we see average, but you can also look at the inequality. How much difference is there in a country between the happiest and the least happy people? And you see that in the this is this is inequality adjusted. That is a combination of the difference. But if you click inequality above, then you will see that the Latin American countries, the average is high.
Let me go to the map. Okay. Yeah.
And the average, is high, but inequality is also very high. And you see that in the US, the inequality in happiness, and the spread around the mean is pretty high, but in the Scandinavian countries, and not only the average is high, but the differences are small. And one of the interesting things is, if you look at the trends, is that the differences in happiness across people are getting smaller over time. And so we have not only the average of the country, we have also the difference in happiness in the country.
That's very, very interesting and important, because you can have, on average, a very happy country, but it's being brought up by a relatively smaller group that is reporting tens on the 10-point scale, but there's also a bunch of people who are quite unhappy. It's much better to have almost everyone at let's say 8.3 rather than a bunch of people at 10 and a bunch of people who are feeling suicidal all the time. And I think that is the measure this thing is capturing, this difference.
Look at Egypt. There is such a country where some people are very happy and a lot of people are very unhappy.
Right. Ukraine is similarly very, very high. Anything above a 2 seems like it's not very good. And you have lots of countries here which are above 2, but also we have some countries like Canada, Argentina. Argentina is doing much better than Brazil in that regard. And here it'd be interesting to see India is above 2, but so is Pakistan. Okay. And Russia is even higher. Okay. Is it related to the Gini index, this score?
This is just a standard deviation.
Okay.
And we know how many people in the country score 0, 1, 2, until 10. Well, then you can compute an average, but you can also compute a standard deviation.
Yeah, I was wondering if it's related to economic inequality. This is happiness inequality. Is it related to economic inequality?
Yes, well, that interesting thing is that in developing countries, there's actually a positive correlation between happiness and economic inequality. And in rich countries, there is a slight negative correlation. And in developing countries, if there is inequality, that means often that there's chances. And that people say, well, I also start a business. I can get ahead. And that keeps people going, and that boosts happiness.
Okay.
Now, I was just thinking that the whole session, I just didn't get a chance to say that community probably plays a very important role, because I was thinking, many developed countries are also now separated and many people feel lonely because of technology. And I was thinking why Denmark is so happy. And then I remember how the strong sense of community that they have, they support each other. They even have this they call adopted grandparents, where you can just ask people from your community to help to babysit your children. While I feel like this is not so much common practice in the US, and probably that's one of the differences why in the US people feel kind of more separated and individualistic rather than in Denmark, where you have so much the strong sense of community. And I was thinking maybe this could be also helpful during the COVID, especially now when you have your community around, you don't feel so separated rather than when you are, alone. And during this time, pandemic time, it's even worse for you.
Yeah, I agree. And well, this sense of community has also been mentioned as one of the reasons why Latin Americans are so happy. But there's also a dark side to community ties, because they can be suffocating. And when there are a lot of pressures, and that seems to be the case in Japan. And the Japanese even have a word for that, on. You are indebted to your parents, you are indebted to your boss. Yes, you are supported, but you are supported at a price. And for instance, in the case of a mate selection, in Japan, if you meet a guy and you say, "Hi, mom, this is him," then mom has an even bigger say than in France.
India may be topping the list, at least when I was growing up. now I think it's better. But
It does.
all right, Gayatri, is there a really small question that you actually know? You know what? We are over time. I'm really sorry, guys. I do want to maintain the 1 hour as the duration for this, and so we're going to have to end now. But I do want to thank you, Professor Ruut, for coming and spending an hour enlightening us on the country level happiness and the differences and why, and all those things. And of course, Elena and Gayatri, thank you so much for coming in. I do want to mention very quickly that John Matthijs was responsible for this, putting us in touch, Professor, with you. And so I'd like to give a little shout out to him as well. Thank you, all of you guys. Over 100 people altogether attended this. Thank you very much for attending. And this is just on Facebook. We have another 100 on YouTube. So I'll see you guys again for the very last happy hour, Happy Smarts Happy Hour, next Friday, this coming Friday on the 31st of July. It's going to be an encore with Professor Vic Strecker from UMich, because there's a bunch of topics that we didn't get to that all of you guys were really interested in. Okay, thank you very much again. See you later next week, and have a great, fabulous, happy weekend. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye.